#Wednesdays Weekly, a weekly information session in collaboration with the voluntary sector and public sector partners. Today's session is on the Rochdale Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan and will be delivered by Mark Brammer and Bernadette Colligan from the Council. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Hayley, and apologies for the slightly later start. B's going to do the slides for me, so we haven't rehearsed this, so it could go well wrong, but I think that we're going to do it as a kind of, I'll introduce myself in a second, but kind of a two-part. So I'll kind of introduce the strategy, and then when we get into the delivery plan, I think B's going to be more specific about the role of the voluntary community, third sector organisations. My name's Mark Brammer. If I do know a couple of people on the call, but if you don't know me, I'm the Council's Climate Change and Sustainability Project Manager. So I suppose I'm responsible for all things climate change. And yeah, kind of putting together the strategy and wider delivery. So B, if you want to go on to the next slide, just by way of a bit of introduction, probably people will be familiar with the fact that Rochdale, like a lot of other local authorities, declared a climate emergency back in July 2019. Now, I'm not sure they fully understood the implications of that declaration, however ambitious it was and important a declaration by the council. But they aligned kind of an ambition for the borough to become carbon neutral by 2038. Now, the reason for the 2038 target that was agreed by council is because that aligns with the target set for Greater Manchester by the Mayor Andy Burnham. So most of the Greater Manchester districts, some are slightly different, have aligned themselves with that particular target. And we've done that for the borough as a whole and for the council, so that for all those things that are under the council's direct control and influence. So it was then the development of climate change strategy is really linked into trying to get, how do we meet that particular ambition? I'm not going to get into debates or discussions about, because there is a difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, and some of the targets we're looking at are based on net zero, and carbon neutrality has a different meaning. But basically that's what we're aiming to do, is to get to carbon neutrality, and the climate change strategy is to support that. So as Hayley mentioned before, and I briefly discussed, we'll set out where we're up to with the strategy, and then I'll hand over to B and she can talk a bit more about what we think the role, because we've defined some of this, but at the end of the day, it's not for the council to dictate what the role of the voluntary community sector is. It's a partnership approach. So next slide, B. So the climate change strategy was developed as a partnership strategy. It's not meant to be the council strategy. I know it's gone through a process of governance in terms of the council, so it was signed off by the council's cabinet in March 2022, but we have a governance approach, which is a climate emergency working group, which is a partnership group. So it's not meant to be just the council. It's chaired by our portfolio holder, but it involves a whole range of stakeholders, including Action Together, but the colleges, the youth parliaments, local business, and it's meant to be a kind of coordinating body to support the development and delivery of the strategy. So I'm not going to kind of spend too much time on this about what we mean by climate change, but we're all aware that that we basically the planet is warming as a result of man-made climate change, which is emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. There is a global target to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees warming from pre-industrial times, which was set at the Paris Climate Change Conference back in 2015. It looks, by all the science this year, particularly with the re-emergence of El Nino, that we're probably going to exceed the 1.5 degrees this year globally. But all the science-based targets that we've adopted as a local authority are based upon the 1.5 degrees of warming. So climate change affects places. So one of the impacts of that, it's this trying to distinguish the difference between weather and climate. And climate is a long-term, has long-term impacts for the places where we you know, where we live and work, and it includes increasingly extreme weather events, you know, whether that's flooding or impacts on nature, and it impacts on people, so the places where we live, so extremes of heat, extremes of you know, of flooding impacts upon people's homes, it impacts upon buildings, it impacts upon issues around inequality. So I don't need to go into too much. I gather most people will have some basic understanding of what the impact of climate change is. So that's the kind of core purpose. And of course, climate change doesn't respect territorial boundaries or administrative boundaries. So CO2 emissions are not kind of restricted to local government administration areas, but we're having to set our targets around carbon emissions based upon estimates of our contribution to global warming as a whole. The next slide, B. So we looked, in terms of developing the strategy, Friends of the Earth actually produced a report on Rochdale back in 2019, which I've been struggling to find recently, but it is there online. It did get a bit of publicity at the time. So they did a bit of an audit of where the borough was up to in terms of key areas of climate change. And as you can see from the slide, we are falling behind significantly in a number of areas in terms of renewable generation, in terms of things like the number of homes in the borough that are well insulated, you know, in terms of active travel, and you know, discouraging people from using cars, things around you know, the way our woodland cover and our natural biodiversity. And also things like, as you can see in I suppose it's the bottom left or the bottom right, is, you know, where the council invests its money in things like the Greater Manchester Pension Fund. So Friends of the Earth kind of did a bit of an audit, and we've used some of that information in terms of developing the strategy itself. So next slide, B. The two main component parts of the climate change strategy for the borough are the Greater Manchester Environment Plan. Now, that's a plan that was produced by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and it focuses around 5 themes: energy, travel, buildings, consumption and production, and natural environment. And it's primarily aimed about carbon reduction in those sectors, right across the conurbation. So it's for Greater Manchester as a whole. And some of the targets within our strategy are built around that. But the next slide, hopefully, the second plank of our strategy, CO2, of course, is an invisible gas, as is methane and others. You can't see it. You can't define it in terms of territorial issues. And sometimes it's quite opaque for people to understand, you know, the implications of that. So we wanted to tie the strategy into things that matter to people's lives. So the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which cover environmental, social and economic sustainability, is a more tangible way of reflecting climate change priorities, because it focuses on things like addressing poverty, looking at improvements in educational outcomes, training and skills, creating more sustainable places to live, you know, life on land, life on water. These have more tangible meaning to people in the borough, and we wanted to ensure that in terms of talking about sustainability, we weren't just focusing on CO2, we were focusing upon outcomes, you know, right across the borough that would improve the lives for people across Rochdale as a whole. Next slide, B. Just to illustrate how difficult this is basically the data for Rochdale. We have updated this, and we're going to do a bit of a review of a kind of audit of where we're up to in terms of the climate change strategy. But if you look at this is our climate change pathway to 2038. Now, we've used the methodology that was adopted by Greater Manchester, and the science-based targets that Greater Manchester are using have been developed in association with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change at Manchester University. So the blue shaded area at the bottom, that's the pathway to net zero. So we won't get hung up on terminology at the moment, but that's the net zero science-based target based on the carbon budgets, which was set through the Paris Climate Change Conference and are incorporated into law through the Climate Change Act 2008 and are reviewed. So they're 5-year budgets. So that kind of looks at carbon reduction up to 2038. The orange bit at the top, which is based on the emissions data we get from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, is where we're at. That's where we are in terms of our targets. So you can see that we're nowhere near to achieving that pathway towards carbon neutrality, and that's the big challenge for us all. And the council itself doesn't have the resources, and we've got to work and influence with other sectors, industry, local people, voluntary community sector to actually to get anywhere near to achieving that target. And I've got to say the latest data is even less encouraging, because if you think in the between the information that's in this graph and the latest data we've got, we had COVID, which obviously reduced people's transport, etc. The actual gap is widening, not getting any narrower. So that's the scope of the challenge we've got between now and 2038. Next slide, B. So just to talk about a little bit about what the council's been doing, and I'm not going to focus on everything, but we've tried to kind of, develop a whole range of projects. So we were successful in getting 11.6 million of funding through Salix, and we've done decarbonisation across 14 of our main buildings, which includes the 3 main leisure centres, a number of schools, number 1 Riverside, and the town hall in Rochdale. And that includes things like putting in heat pumps, LED lighting, fabric improvements, insulation to the buildings, and solar PV and battery storage in terms of renewable generation. So that was a significant amount of work. But 14 buildings, we've probably got responsibility for something like 200 buildings. So you can see, even though they might be the main buildings, we're still scratching the surface. We also got some European funding to build a solar farm at what was a former urban farm at Chamber House near Haywood, between Haywood and Rochdale. And that project is currently on site, and we should be building a 5.5 megawatt solar farm there between now and September. So that's a major project for the borough and for the council itself. The council's also been, following the floods in 2015, been massively successful in bringing in, even though some of this is hidden from view a lot of the time, but about 46 million plus of investment into flood resilience work along the kind of Roach Valley from Littleborough, and there's a whole range of work involved in that. We've also had some funding through Bays to look at the potential to develop heat networks, and the one we're looking at the moment, the key one, is Rochdale Town Centre heat networks, but there are other parts of the borough. But we've kicked off a study to look at the viability of developing a heat network that would be based on anchor public buildings, but would look at the NHS facilities, would look at RBH's housing, would look at the potential to expand that network. We're also trying to do some work which I think may be of interest to the voluntary community sector around cooperative energy. So we're working with Middleton Cooperating, and we got a grant to set up a community energy co-op in Middleton. So we're trying to get a solar co-op off the ground to support communities owning their own renewable energy. And we're looking at a number of public buildings and private businesses together with some other possible assets where we can potentially get some community-owned solar. We've been doing an awful lot of work around tree planting using the council's own estate. It sounds easy that planting trees across the borough, and it's a good way of capturing carbon, but the council doesn't own. I know it might seem that the council owns lots of land, but it doesn't. The majority of the land in the borough, even though it's rural, is in the hands of private landowners or big landowners like United Utilities. But we are looking to accelerate tree planting and other biodiversity schemes using council-owned land and working with schools to do that. There's a commitment to roll out carbon literacy. So we commissioned groundwork last year to deliver carbon literacy for our initial cohort, which was around 250 people. That included staff, key staff members within the council. Shazna was, I think, involved in that as well from voluntary, from Action Together. But it also includes like our senior leadership team and we are starting next month with training for elected members as well. So we're trying to roll out carbon literacy training. At the end of this current financial year, we're looking to develop a wider programme of climate awareness training for council staff. So that's ongoing. B can touch on this later, but we've also, given that we have a lack of resources, the one thing we can try and support is a programme of engagement and communications, and trying to involve local people and residents in understanding what the impacts of climate change is, but understanding what they can do as well. So we're looking at we've supported a number of roles within the council to try and support our climate action programme as well, and we're developing other things. So we've got we can send you the link to this later, but we've developed a local area energy plan. So that looks at how we decarbonise our energy system between now and 2038. That's primarily aimed, looks at things like heating our homes and businesses, electrification of transportation, and how we generate enough renewable energy to mean that we can continue to kind of power those homes and businesses into the future. I've got to say, this isn't a cost to the council, but the bill for that between now and 2038 is 7.1 billion. And that's just, if we get hydrogen as a potential low carbon fuel, then that reduces the costs to about 6 billion, but it's still a massive investment in the energy infrastructure that we've got to look to kind of catalyse over the next 10 to 13 years. We're also looking at how we can use the council's own assets for renewable energy projects. So we've got a programme of work called Go Neutral 2, where we're working with the combined authority to kind of accelerate renewable energy projects where we can. So we're looking at land assets, we're looking at our built environment, we're looking at car parks for things like EV hubs. Whilst that's a slow process, we're right in the middle at the moment of trying to come up with options about how we might take those projects forward. We've got about 20 buildings, 6 land assets, and several car parks where we're looking to deploy renewables in the future. I think, does that cover my bit of it, B? Does that come on to the next step? Oh, sorry. This is the last one, I think, before we get onto the delivery plan. So earlier on, we mentioned, the kind of audit that was done by Friends of the Earth of the councils, where the council or where the borough was up to in terms of its climate commitments. One of the things we set out in the strategy again was, in terms of the ambition, was to try and set some clear targets about what we're trying to achieve. So we've set ourselves a number of key performance indicators across areas like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, energy, the built environment, food and production, food security, and we will be measuring our progress against those key indicators. When we do our kind of performance audit of our progress, we'll be looking at a RAG rating against those key indicators. Again, I've seen the data on that, and I'd love to be able to say we're well on target, but an awful lot of those indicators, they will be either red or amber as opposed to green. So we'll be measuring our progress against those key indicators. One of the things we're going to be that's really important is to make sure we've got the metrics right here in terms of, are the targets we're setting ambitious enough, and we'll need to kind of review those as we go along. So I think that kind of comes to the end. That's basically a quick summary of what's in the strategy. B can probably put a link into where that is on the council's website, but it is available. People can download that. They can use the document as well. And that's the document, the key document that we're using to really drive our approach to climate change across the borough. So I think that covers my bit of it. Does it, B?
Yep, I think so.
I'll hand over to you then.
Yep. So I'm B. I'm the Engagement and Communications Officer for the climate agenda at the council. I'm just going to quickly talk about if this works. Hold on. There we go. Yeah, so part of the climate change strategy outlines the sort of stakeholder involvement and collaborative action that's needed to sort of, you know, take this agenda forward. Obviously, it includes the council, other strategic partners, the VCFSE, enterprise sector, anchor institutions such as the NHS. I think Mark mentioned before about the colleges, schools and colleges, housing providers, businesses, and obviously local residents as well. But how can the VCFSE sector help take action? So I've just pulled a few items from the action plan, and it's things that Action Together are already doing. It's just in terms of developing that, and these are just, again, like Mark said earlier, it's, you know, the action plan can be adapted to sort of suit the VCFSE and what you're all doing at the moment. So one of the actions was around food. So the Food Solutions Warehouse providing food and healthy eating advice and tips to residents that encourage plant-based diets. And obviously there's the community warehouse and the Food Solutions Network that we can sort of tie into that and help develop that with Action Together and other partners. There's the green social prescribing side of things across the borough. You know, we want to enable GPs, healthcare practitioners and local agencies to refer their patients to nature-based interventions and activities. And obviously in Rochdale Borough, we've got a prime example with Petrus. They've got, I don't know if any of the people on the call have visited, but it's an amazing area in Rochdale. I'd highly recommend to go and visit if you get a chance. And then the other thing is creating a women in sustainability network in the borough, and that could involve training and support for local women to be green champions. And one of Rochdale's networks with Action Together is the Women's Services Network, and that might be a development of that. We've also got a couple sort of actions based around the reduce, reuse, recycle. So, you know, encouraging VCFSE organisations to access funding for things like waste prevention, increasing recycling, reuse of household waste, and reducing contamination. We'd like to establish a food project hub in the borough to support redistribution of surplus food and reduce food waste. And this might be something that's already going on across the borough, and it's just making sort of connecting the dots and creating that network of people. And obviously Action Together to help mobilise action in local communities and to provide support for green projects, and obviously directing people to funding that's available. For example, the Green Spaces Fund at the moment, and maybe some of you on the call are aware of the Climate Change Fund, which finished just before Christmas. And I'm just going to go on to the next slide, which showcases who was successful. So this is the sort of local climate action that's going to be going on in Rochdale Borough over the next year. Myself, Shazna and other colleagues at Action Together will be sort of following this story and using them as examples and case studies to encourage other groups to do similar projects, and trying to again sort of reach different communities and you know, encourage them to take action where they can. So you can see there we've got Littleborough Arts Festival, the Rochdale Science Extravaganza, Become United are creating some BA/ME climate change workshops. Humans Manchester have set up a community grocers on wheels. There's Theatre and Flow, which have got a clothes and story swap in April, I believe. You know, to do with sort of fast fashion and that reduce, reuse, recycle side of things. Nigeria Community Association have got a project around climate action for healthy eating. And then lastly, St John's Church, Rochdale, they're developing their community garden as a bit of a green space and a way to raise awareness about green issues. And that's everything. Any
I should have
questions?
mentioned, Hayley, that, just in terms of the distinction, I suppose, between the strategy and the action plan as well, is that the strategy runs to 2025, and we will be doing performance reports back, auditing where we're at against the strategy itself, and it will be due a refresh. The action plan or the delivery plan is much more fluid document, and at the moment it contains some specific actions that are actually ongoing or that are planned, but it also includes an awful lot of aspirational kind of actions that are not necessarily, and an awful lot of them are not directly under the control of the local authority. So it's not a local authority officer that would be responsible for delivering them, which is why we kind of need to work much more closely with the voluntary and community sector about some of those areas. And I think one of the things we wanted to get across is that we would hope that Action Together and the VCFE sector would contribute towards helping to develop the action plan, because we're currently in the process of doing a refresh of the action plan. So we would certainly like to consult and engage with colleagues about things that, what's currently in the action plan, what should be there, and other good ideas and approaches that we can get from right across the borough. So the action plan's a bit more of a fluid, and live document that we need to keep fairly up to date. Sorry about that. I should have mentioned that at the start.
Am I okay to stop sharing?
Yeah, brilliant, Bea. Thank
Yeah.
you. Just going to stop recording.